Hello, I'm John. In the next 3 videos, we'll be exploring the history of the Wright brothers. Thank you for being with us. Although these videos are based on real events, they have been created with the help of AI. Wilbur and Orville Wright were 2 of 7 children born to Milton Wright, a clergyman, and Susan Catherine Kerner. Milton Wright's mother, Catherine Reeder, was descended from the progenitor of the Vanderbilt family, one of America's richest families, and the Huguenot Gano family of New Rochelle, New York. Wilbur was born near Millville, Indiana, in 1867, Orville in Dayton, Ohio, in 1871. The brothers never married. The other Wright siblings were Roiklin, Lauren, Catherine, and twins Otis and Ida. None of the Wright children had middle names. Instead, their father tried hard to give them distinctive first names. Wilbur was named for Wilbur Fisk and Orville for Orville Dewey, both clergymen that Milton Wright admired. They were Will and Orv to their friends and in Dayton, and their neighbors knew them simply as the Bishop's kids, or the Bishop's boys. Because of their father's position as a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, he traveled often and the Wrights frequently moved, 12 times before finally returning permanently to Dayton in 1884. In elementary school, Orville was given to mischief and was once expelled. In 1878, when the family lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, their father brought home a toy helicopter for his 2 younger sons. The device was based on an invention of French aeronautical pioneer Alphonse Pinard. Made of paper, bamboo and cork with a rubber band to twirl its rotor, it was about 1 foot 30 centimeters long. Wilbur and Orville played with it until it broke, and then built their own. In later years, they pointed to their experience with the toy as the spark of their interest in flying. Both brothers attended high school, but did not receive diplomas. The family's abrupt move in 1884 from Richmond, Indiana, to Dayton, Ohio, where the family had lived during the 1870s, prevented Wilbur from receiving his diploma after finishing 4 years of high school. The diploma was awarded posthumously to Wilbur on April 16, 1994, which would have been his 127th birthday, 23, in late 1885 or early 1886, while playing an ice skating game with friends. Wilbur was struck in the face by a hockey stick by Oliver Crookhaw, who later became a serial killer. Wilbur lost his front teeth. He had been vigorous and athletic until then, and although his injuries did not appear especially severe, he became withdrawn. He had planned to attend Yale. Instead, he spent the next few years largely housebound. During this time he cared for his mother, who was terminally ill with tuberculosis, read extensively in his father's library and ably assisted his father during times of controversy within the Brethren Church, but also expressed unease over his own lack of ambition. Orville dropped out of high school after his junior year to start a printing business in 1889, having designed and built his own printing press with Wilbur's help. Wilbur joined the print shop, and in March the brothers launched a weekly newspaper, the West Side News. Subsequent issues listed Orville as publisher and Wilbur as editor on the masthead. In April 1890 they converted the paper to a daily, the evening item, but it lasted only 4 months. They then focused on commercial printing. One of their clients was Orville's friend and classmate, Paul Laurence Dunbar, who rose to international acclaim as a groundbreaking African-American poet and writer. For a brief period the Wrights printed the Dayton Tatler, a weekly newspaper that Dunbar edited. Capitalizing on the national bicycle craze, spurred by the invention of the safety bicycle and its substantial advantages over the penny farthing design, in December 1892 the brothers opened a repair and sales shop, the Wright Cycle Exchange, later the Wright Cycle Company, and in 1896 began manufacturing their own brand. They used this endeavor to fund their growing interest in flight. In the early or mid-1890s they saw newspaper or magazine articles and probably photographs of the dramatic glides by Otto Lilienthal in Germany. 1896 brought 3 important aeronautical events. In May, Smithsonian Institution Secretary Samuel Langley successfully flew an unmanned steam-powered fixed-wing model aircraft. In mid-year, Chicago engineer and aviation authority Octave Chanute brought together several men who tested various types of gliders over the sand dunes along the shore of Lake Michigan. In August, Lilienthal was killed in the plunge of his glider. These events lodged in the minds of the brothers, especially Lilienthal's death. The Wright brothers later cited his death as the point when their serious interest in flight research began. Wilbur said, "Lilienthal was without question the greatest of the precursors, and the world owes to him a great debt." In May 1899, Wilbur wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution requesting information and publications about aeronautics. 30, drawing on the work of Sir George Cayley, Chanute, Lilienthal, Leonardo da Vinci, and Langley, they began their mechanical aeronautical experimentation that year. The Wright brothers always presented a unified image to the public, sharing equally in the credit for their invention. Biographers note that Wilbur took the initiative in 1899 and 1900, writing of my machine and my plans before Orville became deeply involved when the first-person singular became the plural we and our. Author James Tobin asserts, "It is impossible to imagine Orville, bright as he was, supplying the driving force that started their work and kept it going from the backroom of a store in Ohio to conferences with capitalists, presidents, and kings. He was the leader, from the beginning to the end." Wright brothers drawing in Library of Congress. Despite Lilienthal's fate, the brothers favored his strategy, to practice gliding in order to master the art of control before attempting motor-driven flight. The death of British aeronaut Percy Pilcher in another hang-gliding crash in October 1899 only reinforced their opinion that a reliable method of pilot control was the key to successful, and safe, flight. At the outset of their experiments they regarded control as the unsolved third part of the flying problem. The other two parts, wings and engines, they believed were already sufficiently promising. The Wright brothers' plan thus differed sharply from more experienced practitioners of the day, notably Ader, Maxim, and Langley, who all built powerful engines, attached them to airframes equipped with untested control devices, and expected to take to the air with no previous flying experience. Although agreeing with Lilienthal's idea of practice, the Wrights saw that his method of balance and control by shifting his body weight was inadequate. They were determined to find something better. On the basis of observation, Wilbur concluded that birds changed the angle of the ends of their wings to make their bodies roll right or left. The brothers decided this would also be a good way for a flying machine to turn, to bank or lean into the turn just like a bird, and just like a person riding a bicycle, an experience with which they were thoroughly familiar. Equally important, they hoped this method would enable recovery when the wind tilted the machine to one side, lateral balance. They puzzled over how to achieve the same effect with man-made wings and eventually discovered wing warping when Wilbur idly twisted a long inner tube box at the bicycle shop. Other aeronautical investigators regarded flight as if it were not so different from surface locomotion, except the surface would be elevated. They thought in terms of a ship's rudder for steering, while the flying machine remained essentially level in the air, as did a train or an automobile or a ship at the surface. The idea of deliberately leaning, or rolling, to one side either seemed undesirable or did not enter their thinking. Some of these other investigators, including Langley and Chanute, sought the elusive ideal of inherent stability, believing the pilot of a flying machine would not be able to react quickly enough to wind disturbances to use mechanical controls effectively. The Wright brothers, in contrast, wanted the pilot to have absolute control. For that reason, their early designs made no concessions toward built-in stability, such as dihedral wings. They deliberately designed their 1903 first powered flyer with anhedral, drooping, wings, which are inherently unstable, but less susceptible to upset by gusty crosswinds. Park Ranger Tom White demonstrates a replica of the Wright brothers' 1899 box kite at the Wright Brothers National Memorial. On July 27, 1899, the brothers put wing warping to the test by building and flying a biplane kite with a 5-foot, 1.5 m wingspan, and a curved wing with a 1-foot, 0.30 m chord. When the wings were warped, or twisted, the trailing edge that was warped down produced more lift than the opposite wing, causing a rolling motion. The warping was controlled by 4 lines between kite and cross sticks held by the kite flyer. In return, the kite was under lateral control. In 1900 the brothers went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to begin their manned gliding experiments. In his reply to Wilbur's first letter, Octave Chanute had suggested the mid-Atlantic coast for its regular breezes and soft sandy landing surface. Wilbur also requested and examined U.S. Weather Bureau data, and decided on Kitty Hawk after receiving information from the government meteorologist stationed there. Kitty Hawk, although remote, was closer to Dayton than other places Chanute had suggested, including California and Florida. The spot also gave them privacy from reporters, who had turned the 1896 Chanute experiments at Lake Michigan into something of a circus. Chanute visited them in camp each season from 1901 to 1903 and saw gliding experiments, but not the powered flights. The Wrights based the design of their kite and full-size gliders on work done in the 1890s by other aviation pioneers. They adopted the basic design of the Chanute Herring biplane hang glider, double-decker as the Wrights called it, which flew well in the 1896 experiments near Chicago, and used aeronautical data on lift that Otto Lilienthal had published. The Wrights designed the wings with camber, a curvature of the top surface. The brothers did not discover this principle, but took advantage of it. The better lift of a cambered surface compared to a flat one was first discussed scientifically by Sir George Cayley. Lilienthal, whose work the Wrights carefully studied, used cambered wings in his gliders, proving in flight the advantage over flat surfaces. The wooden uprights between the wings of the Wright glider were braced by wires in their own version of Chanute's modified Pratt truss, a bridge building design he used for his biplane glider, initially built as a triplane. The Wrights mounted the horizontal elevator in front of the wings rather than behind, apparently believing this feature would help to avoid, or protect them from, a nosedive and crash like the one that killed Lilienthal. Wilbur incorrectly believed a tail was not necessary, and their first 2 gliders did not have one. According to some Wright biographers, Wilbur probably did all the gliding until 1902, perhaps to exercise his authority as older brother and to protect Orville from harm, as he did not want to have to explain to their father, Bishop Wright, if Orville got injured. No photo was taken with a pilot aboard. The brothers flew the glider for only a few days in the early autumn of 1900 at Kitty Hawk. In the first tests, probably on October 3, Wilbur was aboard while the glider flew as a kite not far above the ground with men below holding tether ropes. Most of the kite tests were unpiloted, with sandbags or chains and even a local boy as ballast. They tested wing warping using control ropes from the ground. The glider was also tested unmanned while suspended from a small homemade tower. Wilbur, but not Orville, made about a dozen free glides on only a single day, October 20th. For those tests the brothers trekked 4 miles 6 kilometers south to the Kill Devil Hills, a group of sand dunes up to 100 feet 30 meters high, where they made camp in each of the next 3 years. Although the glider's lift was less than expected, the brothers were encouraged because the craft's front elevator worked well and they had no accidents. However, the small number of free glides meant they were not able to give wing warping a true test. The pilot lay flat on the lower wing, as planned, to reduce aerodynamic drag. As a glide ended, the pilot was supposed to lower himself to a vertical position through an opening in the wing and land on his feet with his arms wrapped over the framework. Within a few glides, however, they discovered the pilot could remain prone on the wing, headfirst, without undue danger when landing. They made all their flights in that position for the next 5 years. Before returning to Kitty Hawk in the summer of 1901, Wilbur published 2 articles, The Angle of Incidence in the Aeronautical Journal, and The Horizontal Position During Gliding Flight in Illustriert Aeronautische Mittelungen. The brothers brought all of the material they thought was needed to be self-sufficient at Kitty Hawk. Besides living in tents once again, they built a combination workshop and hangar. Measuring 25 feet (7.6 meters) long by 16 feet (4.9 meters) wide, the ends opened upward for easy glider access. Hoping to improve lift, they built the 1901 glider with a much larger wing area and made dozens of flights in July and August for distances of 50 to 400 feet, 15 to 122 m. The glider stalled a few times, but the parachute effect of the forward elevator allowed Wilbur to make a safe flat landing, instead of a nosedive. These incidents wedded the Wrights even more strongly to the canard design, which they did not give up until 1910. The glider, however, delivered two major disappointments. It produced only about one-third the lift calculated and sometimes pointed opposite the intended direction of a turn, a problem later known as adverse yaw, when Wilbur used the wing warping control. On the trip home, a deeply dejected Wilbur remarked to Orville that man would not fly in 1,000 years. The poor lift of the gliders led the Wrights to question the accuracy of Lilienthal's data, as well as the Smeaton coefficient of air pressure, a value which had been in use for over 100 years and was part of the accepted equation for lift. The Wrights used this equation to calculate the amount of lift that a wing would produce. Over the years, a wide variety of values had been measured for the Smeaton coefficient. Chanute identified up to 50 of them. Wilbur knew that Langley, for example, had used a lower number than the traditional one. Intent on confirming the correct Smeaton value, Wilbur performed his own calculations using measurements collected during kite and free flights of the 1901 glider. His results correctly showed that the coefficient was very close to 0.0033, similar to the number Langley used, not the traditional 0.0054, which would significantly exaggerate predicted lift. The brothers decided to find out if Lilienthal's data for lift coefficients were correct. They devised an experimental apparatus which consisted of a freely rotating bicycle wheel mounted horizontally in front of the handlebars of a bicycle. The brothers took turns pedaling the bicycle vigorously, creating airflow over the horizontal wheel. Attached vertically to the wheel were an airfoil and a flat plate mounted 90 degrees away. As air passed by the airfoil, the lift it generated, if unopposed, would cause the wheel to rotate. The flat plate was oriented so its drag would push the wheel in the opposite direction of the airfoil. The airfoil and flat plate were made in specific sizes such that, according to Lilienthal's measurements, the lift generated by the airfoil would exactly counterbalance the drag generated by the flat plate and the wheel would not turn. However, when the brothers tested the device, the wheel did turn. The experiment confirmed their suspicion that either the standard Smeaton coefficient or Lilienthal's coefficients of lift and drag, or all of them, were in error. They then built a 6-foot, 1.8 m, wind tunnel in their shop, and between October and December 1901 conducted systematic tests on dozens of miniature wings. The balances they devised and mounted inside the tunnel to hold the wings looked crude, made of bicycle spokes and scrap metal, but were as critical to the ultimate success of the Wright brothers as were the gliders. The devices allowed the brothers to balance lift against drag and accurately calculate the performance of each wing. They could also see which wings worked well as they looked through the viewing window in the top of the tunnel. The tests yielded a trove of valuable data never before known and showed that the poor lift of the 1900 and 1901 gliders was entirely due to an incorrect Smeaton value, and that Lilienthal's published data were fairly accurate for the tests he had done. Before the detailed wind tunnel tests, Wilbur traveled to Chicago at Chanute's invitation to give a lecture to the Western Society of Engineers on September 18, 1901. He presented a thorough report about the 1900 to 1901 glider experiments and complemented his talk with a lantern slideshow of photographs. Wilbur's speech was the first public account of the brothers' experiments. A report was published in the Journal of the Society, which was then separately published as an off-print titled Some Aeronautical Experiments in a 300-copy printing. Lilienthal had made whirling arm tests on only a few wing shapes, and the Wrights mistakenly assumed the data would apply to their wings, which had a different shape. The Wrights took a huge step forward and made basic wind tunnel tests on 200 scale model wings of many shapes and airfoil curves, followed by detailed tests on 38 of them. An important discovery was the benefit of longer, narrower wings. In aeronautical terms, wings with a larger aspect ratio, wingspan divided by chord, the wing's front-to-back dimension. Such shapes offered much better lift-to-drag ratio than the stubbier wings the brothers had tried so far. With this knowledge, and a more accurate Smeaton number, the Wrights designed their 1902 glider. The wind tunnel tests, made from October to December 1901, were described by biographer Fred Howard as the most crucial and fruitful aeronautical experiments ever conducted in so short a time with so few materials and at so little expense. In their September 1908 Century magazine article, the Wrights explained, the calculations on which all flying machines had been based were unreliable, and every experiment was simply groping in the dark. We cast it all aside and decided to rely entirely upon our own investigations. The 1902 glider wing had a flatter airfoil, with the camber reduced to a ratio of 1:24, in contrast to the previous thicker wing. The larger aspect ratio was achieved by increasing the wingspan and shortening the chord. The glider also had a new structural feature, a fixed, rear vertical rudder, which the brothers hoped would eliminate turning problems. However, the 1902 glider encountered trouble in crosswinds and steep bank turns, when it sometimes spiraled into the ground, a phenomenon the brothers called well-digging. According to Combs, they knew that when the earlier 1901 glider banked, it would begin to slide sideways through the air, and if the side motion was left uncorrected, or took place too quickly, the glider would go into an uncontrolled pivoting motion. Now, with vertical fins added to correct this, the glider again went into a pivoting motion, but in the opposite direction, with the nose swinging downward. Orville apparently visualized that the fixed rudder resisted the effect of corrective wing warping when attempting to level off from a turn. He wrote in his diary that on the night of October 2nd, I studied out a new vertical rudder. The brothers then decided to make the rear rudder movable to solve the problem. They hinged the rudder and connected it to the pilot's warping cradle, so a single movement by the pilot simultaneously controlled wing warping and rudder deflection. The apparatus made the trailing edge of the rudder turn away from whichever end of the wings had more drag and lift, due to warping. The opposing pressure produced by turning the rudder enabled corrective wing warping to reliably restore level flight after a turn or a wind disturbance. Furthermore, when the glider banked into a turn, rudder pressure overcame the effect of differential drag and pointed the nose of the aircraft in the direction of the turn, eliminating adverse yaw. In short, the Wrights discovered the true purpose of the movable vertical rudder. Its role was not to change the direction of flight, as a rudder does in sailing, but rather, to aim or align the aircraft correctly during banking turns and when leveling off from turns and wind disturbances. The actual turn, the change in direction, was done with roll control using wing warping. The principles remained the same when ailerons superseded wing warping. With their new method, the Wrights achieved true control in turns for the first time on October 9th, a major milestone. From September 20th until the last weeks of October, they flew over 1,000 flights. The longest duration was up to 26 seconds, and the longest distance more than 600 feet, 180 meters. Having demonstrated lift, control, and stability, the brothers now turned their focus to the problem of power. Thus did three-axis control evolve, wing warping for roll, lateral motion, forward elevator for pitch, up and down, and rear rudder for yaw, side to side. On March 23, 1903, the Wrights applied for their famous patent for a flying machine, based on their successful 1902 glider. Some aviation historians believe that applying this system of three-axis flight control on the 1902 glider was equal to, or even more significant, than the addition of power to the 1903 Flyer. Peter Jacob of the Smithsonian asserts that perfection of the 1902 glider essentially represents invention of the airplane. In addition to developing the lift equation, the brothers also developed the equation for drag. It is of the same form as the lift equation, except the coefficient of drag replaces the coefficient of lift, computing drag instead of lift. They used this equation to answer the question, is there enough power in the engine to produce a thrust adequate to overcome the drag of the total frame, in the words of Combs. The Wrights then measured the pull in pounds on various parts of their aircraft, including the pull on each of the wings of the biplane in level position in known wind velocities. They also devised a formula for power-to-weight ratio and propeller efficiency that would answer whether or not they could supply to the propellers the power necessary to deliver the thrust to maintain flight. They even computed the thrust of their propellers to within 1% of the thrust actually delivered. In 1903, the brothers built the powered Wright Flyer, using their preferred material for construction, spruce, a strong and lightweight wood, and pride of the West muslin for surface coverings. They also designed and carved their own wooden propellers, and had a purpose-built gasoline engine fabricated in their bicycle shop. They thought propeller design would be a simple matter and intended to adapt data from shipbuilding. However, their library research disclosed no established formulae for either marine or air propellers, and they found themselves with no sure starting point. They discussed and argued the question, sometimes heatedly, until they concluded that an aeronautical propeller is essentially a wing rotating in the vertical plane. On that basis, they used data from more wind tunnel tests to design their propellers. The finished blades were just over 8 feet long, made of 3 laminations of glued spruce. The Wrights decided on twin pusher propellers, counter-rotating to cancel torque, which would act on a greater quantity of air than a single relatively slow propeller and not disturb airflow over the leading edge of the wings. Wilbur made a March 1903 entry in his notebook indicating the prototype propeller was 66% efficient. Modern wind tunnel tests on reproduction 1903 propellers show they were more than 75% efficient under the conditions of the first flights, a remarkable feat, and actually had a peak efficiency of 82%. The Wrights wrote to several engine manufacturers, but none could meet their need for a sufficiently lightweight power plant. They turned to their shop mechanic, Charlie Taylor, who built an engine in just 6 weeks in close consultation with the brothers. To keep the weight down, the engine block was cast from aluminum, a rare practice at the time. The Wright/Taylor engine had a primitive version of a carburetor, and had no fuel pump. Gasoline was gravity-fed from the fuel tank mounted on a wing strut into a chamber next to the cylinders where it was mixed with air. The fuel-air mixture was then vaporized by heat from the crankcase, forcing it into the cylinders. The propeller drive chains, resembling those of bicycles, were supplied by a manufacturer of heavy-duty automobile chains. The Flyer cost less than $1,000, in contrast to more than $50,000 in government funds given to Samuel Langley for his man-carrying great aerodrome. In 1903, $1,000 was equivalent to $35,000 in 2024. The Wright Flyer had a wingspan of 40.3 feet, 12.3 meters, weighed 605 pounds, 274 kilograms, and had a 12 horsepower, 8.9 kilowatts, 180 pounds, 82 kilograms engine. On June 24, 1903, Wilbur made his second presentation in Chicago to the Western Society of Engineers. He gave details about their 1902 experiments and glider flights, but avoided any mention of their plans for powered flight. That's the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episodes.